It was Dennis's 40th birthday, but nothing about it felt like a celebration. His high-rise apartment in Chicago, sleek and modern, was filled with the laughter of people he barely knew. A crowd of Celeste's friends that seemed to laugh a little too loudly, their voices like a distant hum in his mind. Dennis stood in the corner of the room, trying to hide behind the food table, pretending to enjoy the party, but his attention kept drifting. He was supposed to be the center of attention today, but instead, the apartment buzzed with Celeste's friends, and Rachel, his stepdaughter, had practically taken over the evening with her aloofness. She was too busy showing off for her friends to even glance in his direction. It wasn't that he expected anything grand or extravagant, but a little recognition, a simple acknowledgement from his wife would have been nice. Celeste was gliding through the crowd, her laughter echoing through the room as she sipped on a glass of champagne, her hair glinting under the lights. She looked stunning, of course, as always. Dennis was proud of her. She had every reason to be proud of herself, too. But there was something about tonight that felt different. Something that made him feel small, like he didn't belong in this world of polished smiles and expensive tastes. "Dennis, you're not hiding back here, are you?" Celeste's voice came from behind him, soft and warm, but laced with an edge of worry. Dennis turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just making sure there's enough food," he said, gesturing to the trays of finger foods on the table, which he'd helped arrange earlier. It didn't matter that he'd spent all afternoon setting everything up, that he'd called the catering company himself and worked with them to ensure everything would be perfect. He felt invisible. As Celeste turned back to the crowd, his gaze drifted to Rachel, who was in the middle of a conversation with a group of her friends. He saw how they were looking at him, eyes that flicked over him, then moved on as if he didn't matter, as if he was just part of the background. The laughter around him was beginning to grate on his nerves when Rachel's voice cut through the noise. "Ugh, my mom really went all out for this, huh?" Rachel said, turning to her friends, her voice dripping with disdain. "And my stepdad, he's over there playing mechanic or whatever. I guess that's how he spends his time." The words hit Dennis like a slap. His chest tightened and his eyes flicked to Celeste, hoping, just hoping, that she'd do something, anything, to defend him. But Celeste was laughing, her hand on Rachel's shoulder, nodding in agreement as if the comment didn't sting at all. "Dennis is great at what he does," Celeste said lightly, her voice still high and carefree, not realizing, or maybe just ignoring, how much the comment had hurt. It was the same old thing. Over the years, his profession, working as a mechanic, had always been something they treated as a joke. He had tried over and over again to prove that he was more than just a mechanic, that there was pride in the work he did. But the jokes kept coming, the dismissiveness kept coming, and Celeste, she didn't even notice. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't care enough to change it. Dennis took a slow breath, trying to keep his composure. He could feel the walls closing in. This was his party, his day. Yet he was nothing more than a prop, a background character in a play he hadn't signed up for. Rachel and her friends moved away, and Dennis stood there, staring at the table, his fingers gripping the edge, trying to steady himself. He didn't belong here, not in this life, not in this world of shiny people with perfect clothes and perfect lives. He looked at his watch, 9 p.m. His 40th birthday had barely even begun, but already it felt like the night was over. The party had ended. The laughter and music had faded from Dennis's high-rise apartment, replaced by silence, the kind of silence that gnawed at him. He sat on the edge of the couch, nursing a glass of whiskey that had grown warm, staring out the window at the city lights. Below him, the streets buzzed with life, but up here, in this glass tower, it felt like he was a world away. Dennis thought back to the last time he'd felt truly alive in this place, when he and Celeste had first moved in. Back then, everything had felt like it had a purpose. The dinners they shared, the vacations, the promises. He had been her partner in every sense of the word, committed to building a life together. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Celeste had dreams, ambitious ones, dreams that were too big for their modest beginnings. And he had always been there, supporting her, helping her chase them. The first big sacrifice had come when he sold his prized Mustang to help pay for her business courses. It was a car he had loved, a symbol of his youth and freedom, but he had loved her more. He had watched her grow and succeed, and it had been worth it. Then there were the long hours, the nights Dennis had worked overtime, not for his own benefit, but to make sure Celeste's career continued to rise. When she wanted to expand her network, Dennis had done the dirty work. He had given up his weekends to chauffeur her to events, taking care of everything at home, quietly bearing the weight of their lives while she reached for more. But it hadn't been the sacrifices that had drained him. It was the quiet obedience, the silence that had taken over his role in the family. Where once he had been an equal partner, now he was a background character in a story he no longer recognized. Celeste's dreams had become his duty, and as her career flourished, he had faded into the background. And Rachel. Dennis had tried to be a good father figure to her. He had treated her like his own, bought her whatever she wanted, supported her through school, and even paid for things that weren't his responsibility. But it never felt enough. It never seemed to earn him her respect. She had always kept a distance, and tonight, hearing her casually dismiss his profession, it had finally sunk in. He had tried for years to fit in, to prove his worth in a world that valued appearances over substance. But it was clear now. They didn't see him. Not really. Dennis's mind flashed to the past few years, his own gradual erasure, the missed opportunities for connection, the way Celeste's and Rachel's lives had become more important than his own. He had spent years pretending he was content, that his sacrifices didn't matter, but tonight, the truth had hit him like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just invisible at his birthday, he had been invisible in his own life. His hand tightened around the glass of whiskey, the liquid sloshing as he stood up. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but the weight of everything he had given, everything he had lost, settled on his shoulders like a burden too heavy to bear anymore. The duffel bag sat by the door, an old relic from his days when he had been someone else. Someone who wasn't afraid to step away, to take his life back. He had been that man once, and he could be him again. Dennis walked over to the bag, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what his next step would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not when he had been reduced to a shadow in his own home. He packed quickly, the movements automatic, a few shirts, some jeans. He didn't bother with anything else. It didn't matter. His life had been reduced to a few items of clothing, a few years of memories. The rest was a lie, an illusion he had built to please others, to keep the peace. As he zipped up the bag, he glanced around the apartment one last time. The view, the furniture, the empty spaces that had once been filled with the promise of a life he had worked so hard for, it all felt like a distant memory now. He turned, walked to the door, and opened it. Stepping into the hallway, he felt a strange sense of freedom. It wasn't anger that drove him. It was a quiet realization that he had been living for everyone else, that his devotion had never been reciprocated. Dennis didn't look back. He just kept walking, his footsteps echoing in the silence, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Dennis drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkened roads as the city of Chicago slowly disappeared behind him. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, the hum of the engine becoming a steady pulse in the silence. The city, once a place of opportunity and success, now felt like a weight he could no longer carry. The life he had built, the sacrifices he had made, and the people who had slowly erased him from their own narrative, they all seemed so distant now. He had no destination in mind, but his body knew where to go. The familiar route to his brother Nate's place was a comfort, like an old coat you slip into when you need warmth. Nate had always been the one person who understood him without judgment, without expectations. The night air felt cold against the glass as Dennis passed through the outskirts of the city, the neon signs and streetlights fading into the rear-view mirror. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He didn't need answers or resolutions. What he needed, what he craved more than anything, was silence. The kind of silence that filled the space between thoughts, the kind that let him breathe again. Hours passed, and the monotonous scenery of farmland and empty highways blurred together as the landscape shifted from city to countryside. He finally pulled off the road near Rockford, stopping at a gas station. The harsh lights above the pumps felt strangely comforting, marking the break between his past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Dennis stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs and clearing his mind. He stretched, feeling the tension in his muscles loosen as he walked to the station's convenience store to grab a drink. He couldn't help but think about the last few days. The party, Rachel's dismissive comment, Celeste's indifference, it had all led him here. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic scene. It had been slow, like water wearing away at a stone, until there was nothing left but the need to leave. Dennis paid for the drink and walked back to his car, still unsure of what exactly he was looking for. He just knew that he couldn't stay where he had been. In his mind, the city of Chicago had become a cage, a place that had once been full of dreams, but was now just a reminder of how much he had lost, how invisible he had become. When he finally reached Nate's place, the familiar sight of the small auto shop, surrounded by old cars and the quiet hum of engines, grounded him. There was something simple and honest about Nate's life that Dennis had always admired. There were no pretenses here, no fake smiles, no one looking down on anyone else. Just hard work, a bit of grease, and the satisfaction of building something from the ground up. Dennis exhaled, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly as he walked into the shop. Nate was working on an old Chevy in the corner, the scent of motor oil and metal filling the air. When Nate looked up and saw him standing there, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't expect you, man. You good?" Nate asked, his voice steady, without judgment. Dennis nodded, setting his duffel bag down in the corner. "Yeah, just needed to get out for a bit. Think I'll stay here for a while." Nate didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just nodded and wiped his hands on a rag, moving toward the small cot in the back. "Sleep if you need to. I'll take care of the shop. You know where the coffee's at." And just like that, Dennis felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying ease off his shoulders. There was no need for explanations here, no expectations. It was a quiet escape, but it was exactly what he needed. As he lay on the cot later that night, the sounds of the shop's quiet hum surrounding him, Dennis allowed himself to finally breathe, his mind not racing with thoughts of the life he had left behind. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to peace. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but in this moment, he was free. The quiet of Nate's auto shop was a balm to Dennis's restless mind. But even in the stillness, his thoughts continued to churn. His departure from Chicago had given him the temporary peace he needed. But now, in the calm, the past continued to weigh heavily on him. The years of sacrifice for Celeste, the sacrifices for Rachel, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Sitting in the shop's back room, Dennis began sorting through old documents he had packed in the duffel bag, the remnants of his previous life, the years of work and investment he had poured into building something for his family. His hands hovered over tax returns, investment accounts, and old financial records that had once seemed like milestones of success. But now, they felt more like relics of a dream that had collapsed long ago. It was during this search that Dennis noticed something off. One of the records, a series of transactions made under his name, was irregular. Large sums of money had been withdrawn from his account, money he didn't remember spending, nor had any record of approval for. His brow furrowed, and his heart sank as he traced the withdrawals back to the Vineyard Project, a name that had been part of Celeste's business plans in the past. Dennis felt a cold sweat prick his skin as he remembered the conversations he'd overheard about expanding into the vineyard business. He had thought it was just talk, part of Celeste's grand vision. But this was real. The transactions were recent, far too recent. He sat back in his chair, shaking his head as he processed what he was seeing. Celeste had always downplayed her spending habits, always insisted that the business would eventually pay off. But this was something else. The realization was a gut punch. He had been working tirelessly for years to provide for her dreams, but in the background, his trust was being violated. Celeste wasn't just using him, she was stealing from him. But it didn't end there. As he continued to scroll through the records, another detail caught his eye. A series of funds, marked as investment transfers, had been funneled into a separate account linked to a new vineyard project. Dennis's heart raced as he recognized the name of the architect involved, someone Celeste had recently started working with. His instincts kicked in. The architect was a name he didn't know well, but he had seen him at a few of Celeste's events. Celeste's meetings were often filled with talk about future business ventures, but Dennis had always dismissed them as part of the corporate facade she liked to project. He never thought to question where the money was going. Suddenly, everything made sense. Celeste and her new partner were siphoning off funds, using his name and trust to fund their own personal interests. And Rachel was in on it too. She had helped them. Or, at least, she had turned a blind eye. Dennis felt the anger build up, but it was a quiet, seething kind of rage, the kind of fury that made your stomach twist. And then it hit him, the smart security system he had installed in their high-rise apartment. He remembered the cameras, the security footage that had always been just a little too clear. With a sense of determination, Dennis pulled out his phone, accessing the camera feed with ease. He felt a mixture of dread and resolve as he sifted through the footage. It wasn't long before he found what he was looking for. Celeste and the architect sat in the living room, laughing lightly as they discussed plans for the stolen funds. They spoke casually, as if they were discussing a business deal. "Once the funds are moved, we can start on the vineyard project," the architect said, smiling as he made notes on a legal pad. "We'll make it big, Celeste. You've got the connections. I'll handle the design." "I know," Celeste replied, her voice smooth, almost indifferent. "But I'm not sure about Dennis. He's been getting suspicious. We need to keep him in the dark for a little longer." Dennis's heart raced as he heard the words. The betrayal was worse than he had imagined. Celeste, the woman he had devoted his life to, was not just taking him for granted. She was actively scheming against him, stealing from him, and lying to his face. He stopped the video and sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, had been a lie. Celeste, Rachel, the business, it was all a facade, and Dennis was nothing more than an unwitting pawn in their game. But now, Dennis knew the truth, and the truth was something he couldn't ignore anymore. The life he had built wasn't his. It was theirs, and it was time to dismantle it. Slowly, methodically, but he wasn't going to let it break him. Not anymore. Dennis closed his eyes, taking a slow, steadying breath. He wasn't just going to walk away. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He was going to take back what was his, and then some. He just had to figure out how to do it without leaving any trace of himself behind. He reached for his phone, preparing to make the first of many calls that would change everything. Dennis sat at the small desk in Nate's auto shop, the soft hum of the shop's equipment in the background. His hands were busy, but his mind was elsewhere. He had just uncovered the truth. Celeste and her new partner had been draining his finances for months, using his name and trust to fuel their own selfish ambitions. The betrayal burned in his chest, but it also sparked something else: determination. For the first time in years, Dennis felt like he had control over his life again. He wasn't just a passive observer in his own story. He could take action. Slowly, methodically, he began to work, setting the wheels in motion. His first step was to reach out to those who owed him favors. Over the years, Dennis had helped countless people. He had always gone out of his way to assist others, whether it was fixing a car in the middle of a snowstorm or providing legal advice to someone who couldn't afford a lawyer. These people owed him, and now he needed to collect on those debts. Dennis sat at his desk, pulling up old contacts on his phone. The first call was to a customs agent he had helped years ago. They had crossed paths during a snowstorm when Dennis had fixed his car for free, no questions asked. The agent had been grateful and had promised to return the favor someday. "Hey, Dennis," the agent said when he picked up. "What's up?" "I need a favor," Dennis said, keeping his tone calm but his voice steady with purpose. "I need you to look into something for me. It's about a business venture involving my wife. I think it's more than just a little shady." The agent agreed to help, his tone shifting immediately into professional mode. "I'll start looking into it. I can get you the information by next week." "Appreciate it," Dennis said before ending the call. The next call was to an old friend who worked in real estate. They had done business together in the past, and Dennis had always helped him when he needed it. This time, Dennis needed to know more about Celeste's vineyard project, specifically the properties she and her partner were involved in. The conversation was short, and the friend promised to dig into the details for him. Dennis knew that these connections, these favors, would give him the leverage he needed. Each call, each exchange, brought him closer to the truth, to the moment when he would expose everything. Dennis wasn't looking for revenge. He just wanted the truth out in the open. The facade Celeste had built needed to come down, and he was the one who would bring it down, quietly and without drama. His mind kept returning to the footage he had seen, the casual way Celeste spoke about her plans, the way she spoke about him as if he were just a problem to be solved. The words echoed in his mind. "We need to keep him in the dark for a little longer." Dennis's fists clenched as he thought about how they had treated him like a fool for so long. But he wasn't a fool anymore. He was going to make sure that they felt the consequences of their actions. He worked in silence that night, sending out emails, following up on calls, and gathering everything he could. Each small victory, a document here, a name there, felt like a step toward reclaiming what had been taken from him. By the time the sun began to rise, Dennis had a plan. He had the tools, the connections, and most importantly, the evidence to expose everything. The weight of the betrayal no longer felt heavy. Now, it felt like the first step toward his own redemption. Dennis leaned back in the chair, taking a moment to breathe. The quiet, steady pace of his work in the auto shop felt good. It was simple, honest work. Nothing like the convoluted, backstabbing world Celeste had created. He felt grounded, free from the weight of his old life, and in that moment, he knew that the tide was turning. Dennis sat at the worn wooden table in the back of Nate's auto shop, his fingers absently tracing the edge of a photo of his Mustang, one of the few items from his old life that he hadn't been able to let go of. The familiar surroundings of the shop, the old tools and the hum of engines, felt more like home now than his high-rise apartment ever had. The pressure from his previous life, the stress, the betrayal, was starting to dissipate. But he couldn't rest just yet. The final move, the one that would undo everything Celeste and her new partner had built, required precision. He had everything in place now, connections, evidence, and a clear sense of purpose. It was time to make sure they would never have the chance to deceive him again. Dennis had already started collecting evidence, quietly, methodically. He had combed through financial records, built a web of contacts, and ensured that every transaction tied to Celeste and her architect partner was documented. But there was one more piece to the puzzle, something that would seal the deal and deliver the knockout blow. The drone. It was something he had bought Rachel years ago, something that had been used for weekend projects and fun. But now, it was going to be used for something far more important. Gathering footage of Celeste and her partner in compromising conversations. Dennis spent hours modifying the drone, attaching a small camera capable of recording discrete footage without being detected. He had access to the apartment, and he knew exactly when Celeste and her partner would be discussing their plans. The security system he had installed, designed to keep their home safe, would now be the very thing that exposed them. The thought of using Rachel's drone for this felt strange. He had bought it for her, a gesture meant to show his love and support, and now he was turning it into a tool of justice. But it didn't matter. Rachel had made her choices. She had shown her loyalty to Celeste, and now Dennis had to act. He took the drone outside, watching the blade spin as it hovered above the shop's parking lot. As the drone soared higher, Dennis thought back to the days when he had believed that family came first. That loyalty meant something, but the illusion had shattered long ago. Now, it was all about securing his future. Dennis spent the next few days carefully documenting the movements of Celeste and her partner, watching as they met in hidden corners of the apartment, discussing the stolen funds and their plans for the vineyard. They spoke openly, unaware of the eyes in the sky. Dennis kept everything he collected, storing the footage in secure files, knowing that this would be the final piece of evidence he needed. It wasn't just about exposing their financial crimes. It was about ensuring Rachel couldn't benefit from any of their illegal activities. He had already begun modifying Rachel's college trust, rerouting the funds into an account that couldn't be touched. She would no longer be able to access any money tied to her mother's fraud. Dennis wasn't doing this for revenge. Not exactly. He was doing it because he had been pushed too far, because he had spent years being invisible in his own life. Now, he was taking back control. This was about making sure that the people who had used him would never do so again. The final piece of the plan was coming together, and Dennis could feel the weight of the past few weeks lifting from his shoulders. He was closing in on them, preparing to strike with everything he had. But this time, it would be silent, methodical, and when it was over, Dennis would finally be free. The night was silent except for the steady hum of the small fan in the corner of Nate's shop. Dennis sat at the workbench, surrounded by tools, his mind focused on the quiet, calculated task ahead. For days he had gathered the evidence, bank statements, fraudulent transfers, camera footage, and now the time had come to take action. He had done everything carefully, meticulously. No dramatics, no confrontation. This was about ensuring the truth came out, but without the spectacle that Celeste and her partner would surely expect. Dennis picked up his phone, his fingers tapping quickly as he sent the final documents to his contacts. The fraud complaint, the evidence, everything that would expose Celeste's betrayal was now in the hands of the authorities. He arranged for it to be submitted to the right people, at the right time, so that the investigation would be discreet but undeniable. The last thing he needed was for Celeste to have any inkling of what was coming. He sent the evidence to the Vineyard's board, the very people Celeste had been trying to impress, the people she had deceived for years. He knew they would act swiftly once the truth was in their hands. Along with them, Dennis made sure to send copies to the foreign investors involved in her shady dealings. They had the power to freeze assets, to halt the illegal transactions she and her partner had been orchestrating. As the messages sent, Dennis took a deep breath. The weight of the past few weeks had been heavy, but now it felt like a burden was lifting. There was no confrontation, no shouting matches, no dramatic fallout. Just the quiet execution of a plan years in the making. He felt no satisfaction in the chaos that would follow, no gloating over the collapse of Celeste's empire. That wasn't why he was doing this. It was about ensuring the people who had used him, betrayed him, had their world turned upside down. And now they would face the consequences. But there was something peaceful about it. The quietness of the plan, the fact that Dennis wasn't the one causing the storm. He was simply the one who had set it in motion. As he finished typing his last message to the authorities, Dennis sat back and let out a long, slow exhale. He wasn't the man he used to be, the one who silently obeyed, the one who gave up everything for a family that never appreciated him. Now, he was the one who had taken control, the one who had made sure the truth came out in its own time, without him lifting a finger beyond the necessary steps. Dennis knew Celeste's world would unravel quietly, but completely. He wouldn't be there to witness it. He wouldn't need to. What mattered now was that he had finally done something for himself. And as he set the phone down, he realized that he wasn't waiting for any grand payoff or apology. His victory was in the peace he had fought for, in the new life he was creating away from the chaos. He stood up, stretched, and grabbed his jacket. He didn't need to stay here anymore. The work was done. The truth was out there now, and Celeste and her partner would have to answer for what they had done. Dennis walked toward the door, taking one last look at the shop before stepping outside into the cool night air. He was finally free. It had been a few weeks since Dennis had made his move. The ripple effects of his quiet actions were already being felt in every corner of Celeste's life. The Vineyard, once her crown jewel, was now under full audit, with every transaction scrutinized. The money she had funneled into personal projects was being tracked, the fraud uncovered and exposed. Celeste was no longer the managing partner. She had been replaced, her control over the business slipping through her fingers. Dennis had no interest in the details of her fall. He didn't care to watch her scramble to explain her actions. He had done what needed to be done, and now he was moving on. Rachel, however, wasn't so easy to ignore. She had always been a part of Dennis's life, for better or worse. The tension between them had always been there, simmering beneath the surface, and now, with everything that had happened, it was even more pronounced. The realization of the consequences of her mother's actions, of her own complicity, had finally sunk in. One afternoon, as Dennis was leaving the regional training school where he now taught, he saw a familiar car parked outside. He knew who it was before he even stepped closer. Rachel was sitting in the driver's seat, her face hidden behind her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. She looked different, smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to her. Dennis stopped in his tracks, watching her for a moment, unsure if he should approach. But then the window rolled down, and Rachel looked up, her eyes red from what looked like hours of silent crying. "Dennis," she said softly, her voice shaky. I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I treated you. For what happened with Mom. I didn't see it until it was too late." Dennis remained silent for a moment, his emotions swirling inside him. He had spent years trying to make her see him, trying to earn her respect. But now, as he looked at her, he felt a sense of distance, a finality. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was simply done. "You don't need to apologize to me," Dennis said, his voice calm but firm. "You've made your choices. I made mine. And now, we both have to live with them." Rachel's face fell, and for a brief moment, Dennis saw the girl she had been. A daughter who once looked to him for guidance, for support. But that girl was gone. This was someone different, someone who had been shaped by the same forces that had pushed him aside for years. And in that moment, Dennis realized that he didn't need to engage with her anymore. He didn't need to fix anything. His life, now, was his own. "Take care of yourself, Rachel," Dennis said, turning away. "That's all you can do now? He didn't look back as he walked away from the car, from the past. He wasn't cold or harsh. He was simply done. It was a quiet goodbye, the kind that didn't require confrontation or drama. It was the final act of closure he needed. Dennis found peace in the stillness of his new life. He spent his days teaching at the regional training school for aircraft maintenance, sharing his knowledge with eager students who looked up to him, not as a mechanic, but as a skilled professional. He worked alongside Nate in the evenings, restoring vintage planes, a simple task that felt like real work, the kind he could be proud of. There were no demands, no expectations, just the satisfaction of doing something well. The chaos of his old life, of Celeste, Rachel, and the constant tension, seemed so distant now. Dennis had found his own quiet rhythm, his own place where he was valued not for what he could give, but for who he was. It was a life free from the toxic relationships of his past, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. In the quiet, steady work that filled his days, Dennis had finally found something that had eluded him for so long: peace. Months had passed since Dennis had set everything in motion. Celeste's life was in ruins. The vineyard, once her pride and joy, was now under full audit, with the board members scrambling to understand how they had been duped for so long. The stolen funds had been traced, and the illegal transactions were halted. She and her new partner were facing charges. Her once thriving business had crumbled, and her future, built on a foundation of lies and deceit, had collapsed. But Dennis wasn't there to witness the fallout. He hadn't attended the hearings or any of the aftermath. He didn't need to. He had orchestrated the exposure, quietly and without fanfare, and now he was free. As for Rachel, she had finally come to terms with the consequences of her actions. She had apologized to Dennis for the way she had treated him. Her words had been heartfelt, but they hadn't reached him in the way they once might have. He had nothing left to give her, no more energy to invest in someone who had turned a blind eye to the truth for so long. Dennis had moved on. He had found peace in the quiet rhythm of his new life. Teaching at the regional training school for aircraft maintenance was fulfilling in a way he had never imagined. He found satisfaction in shaping the next generation of mechanics, watching them grow in their craft, knowing that his work mattered. For the first time in years, he felt respected, not for the money he could give or the sacrifices he had made, but for the knowledge he shared and the impact he had on their lives. It wasn't just about teaching, though. Dennis had begun restoring vintage planes with Nate again, spending weekends in the shop, getting his hands dirty with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It was honest work, real work, the kind that didn't need recognition to feel valuable. He had built a life based on that, and it was enough. One afternoon, as he was leaving the school, his phone buzzed with a voicemail. He didn't recognize the number, but he already knew who it was before the message began. It was Rachel. The message was simple, a quiet apology wrapped in regret. "I've been thinking about everything, Dennis. I'm sorry. I know I can't change what happened, but I just wanted you to know that I see things differently now. I'm sorry for how I treated you." Dennis listened to the message, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. Forgiveness in his mind was earned, not given on request. Rachel had her own path to walk now, and he wasn't going to be the one to guide her through it. He had done all he could. He set the phone down, took a deep breath, and glanced out at the open sky. The life he had built for himself now felt like a reward, not for any grand victory, but for the peace he had found. The quiet, steady life he had constructed for himself was more fulfilling than any dramatic gesture of revenge ever could be. Dennis wasn't looking for recognition anymore. He wasn't looking for approval. He had made peace with who he was, with the choices he had made, and with the quiet victory he had earned. For the first time in a long time, Dennis could finally say that he was content.